Welcome to Behavioral Grooves, the podcast that explores the stories, the science, and the secrets of behavioral science. I'm Kurt Nelson.
And I'm Tim Houlihan. We are lucky enough to talk to some of the leading experts in the world about their research and the insights that they discover. And the best part is that we get to share those conversations with you.
Ooh, and today's guest is extra special. Do you know why, Tim?
I think I do, but let me hear why you think he's special first.
Well, not only did our guest write a paper on a subject that we're particularly fond of, extrinsic motivation, or as we like to refer to it in the industry, rewards and incentives.
Oh, yeah.
But his research supports the hypothesis that we've both had on this topic for many, 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 many years.
It does indeed support that hypothesis. Wait a minute. That kind of begs the question. You don't suppose that we like this because it's like a confirmation bias thing, do you?
Oh, I hadn't thought about that, but maybe it's playing a role in this. But no, damn it. The research is just so damn good. It can't be confirmation bias.
Okay, it is. And it is really good. And we
I thought you were going to say it is confirmation bias.
Well, this particular piece of research is fantastic. And our conversation today is with Indranil Goswami. He's an assistant professor at the University of Buffalo. And the research that we're talking about is his paper with Oleg Urminsky. And it's called The Dynamic Effect of Incentives on Post-Reward Task Engagement.
Okay. Boring title, but really cool research. And what Tim and I are so excited about is that this paper shows that incentives don't have a negative long-term impact on intrinsic motivation, and that they may even have a net positive effect when you look out over a long enough time frame.
Yeah, which is what we've been telling companies for years. Mm-hmm. And now with confirmation bias in full swing, we can actually have proof to back it up.
Well, Tim, we've always had proof, just not published research article proof like this.
Yeah, that's very true. Actually, we both have good data to support it, but unpublished. Yes.
Unpublished data, and now it's published, and it's in a famous research journal. There you go. All right. Yeah. Well, should we probably get on with the show?
Yes, let's do. So sit back, folks, with your favorite non-intrinsic reducing incentive cocktail and listen to our conversation with Indranil Goswami. Indranil Goswami, welcome to Behavioral Grooves.
Thank you so much, Tim, Kurt, and Mary. I'm glad to be here.
We are very, very glad to have you here. And we'd like to get started with a quick question here. Would you prefer coffee or tea?
Tea.
That was
nice.
Not the coffee drinker. Okay.
Perfect.
So here's the second of our speed round questions. Would you rather have a relaxing day at the beach or an active adventure in the mountains?
Active adventure in the mountains.
Oh, yeah. Not the beach sitting around.
I'm not the beach guy. Yeah, I don't like sand sticking in my feet.
Great. That's great.
Love it.
The sticky sand is no fun. Okay, so let's imagine this. You could have dinner with any two researchers, dead or alive, any two researchers in the world for dinner. Who would you want to share a conversation with?
Maybe Danny Kahneman and Dan Ariely.
Oh, yeah. Wow. And happily, they're both alive. So
that could happen. Any listeners who want to get that to happen for Indranil will have that happen there. So
thank you.
Okay. So this last question, hopefully you'll have an answer for us because this is kind of a big thing here. So is it true that extrinsic incentives always suppress intrinsic motivation?
The answer is no.
Good.
And that's not only based on my research, but it is also based on past research. And the research which has been done for like almost 4 decades does not unambiguously say that extrinsic rewards would always kind of, reduce intrinsic motivation. The research actually is kind of pretty ambiguous about what the conclusions are. And in fact, there are different types of, factors, for example, the type of rewards, whether it is verbal rewards versus, whether it is tangible money and stuff like that, which affects subsequent motivation and behavior.
Yeah.
So the answer is no.
Which is good because we wanted to talk to you about that research that you've done as well as the other research that's gone on this in particular about the paper that you wrote with Oleg Urminsky called The Dynamic Effect of Incentives on Post-Reward Task Engagement, which to Tim and me, we really loved because, again, as you mentioned, there's been 4 decades of research out there about this, but the popular kind of opinion or common wisdom that kind of has been prevalent, at least in industry, maybe even I think in some of the research industry, is that, you know what, extrinsic rewards reduce subsequent intrinsic motivation, or that's the thought. They've had everything from Alfie Kohn to some of the other pieces that have gone out and kind of gotten popular press on this. But
Correct.
Tell us a little bit about that research and what you discovered.
Yes, you're right. I mean, there is this very popular belief that extrinsic rewards would reduce intrinsic motivation. Although the research the literature is kind of not very clear on that. And one of the reasons why this kind of a conclusion has taken is kind of so popular is because there is this meta-analysis, so to speak, a kind of an analysis of all the studies which were done probably until 1999, which I think is almost 2.5 decades, which kind of says, yes, it does reduce intrinsic motivation. And I think many of those authors which you mentioned kind of took the cue from that and kind of, developed that into maybe books and theses. But one reason, the question is, how do you, kind of make sense of this literature, right? And the other thing which is also important to understand is there are these 2 streams of work on incentives, one primarily done by the psychologists and other, as you can imagine, is done by the economists, right? And in economics, incentives are like a huge kind of lever which can affect behavior. And economists would love to believe that, you give incentives, people do the behavior more. You remove incentives, they would just go back to what they were doing before the incentives. Why should they reduce doing what they were earlier doing at a certain level, right? And indeed, many of the experiments, particularly field experiments, which were run by economists, actually found that in the longer run, by which I mean in the post-incentive period, maybe, after 6 months, you give people incentives for stopping to smoke. And then after 6 odd months, they find people essentially either kind of do a little better than what they were doing before the incentives were introduced, or maybe they are kind of pretty much at the same level. They go back to what they were doing, right? So clearly, that is inconsistent with this extremely strong belief that incentives are harmful. So what I do in my dissertation actually is study this behavior, particularly the post-reward behavior, which is where all the action is, so to speak, because it is kind of understood that incentives would work when the incentives are present. That is, they would actually improve behavior, particularly for certain type of tasks. So I also should mention that there are certain other tasks where incentives might be harmful when they are present. That is, they might reduce people's behavior and engagement when they are present compared to when they were not even there. For example, pro-social behavior, right? When you're thinking of, helping others. If I pay you to help others, you might start thinking that maybe if an onlooker understands that I am being paid to help, they would infer that I'm not really a altruistic person, but I'm actually doing this behavior only because I'm being paid.
Yep.
And that's not a good signal about myself. So I would rather not do this pro-social act during the time when the reward is present, just to kind of make sure that I bolster my, self-presentation, right? So that's a different kind of task, but we essentially look at tasks where there are no, self-presentation motives, where there is no pro-social angle and stuff like that.
Like in the world of sales incentives, for instance.
Absolutely. Sales incentives is one great example. Similarly, incentives for, going to the gym, for example, right? Incentives for kind of, reading a book, for example, right? Those kind of stuff would be in this kind of a paradigm, was used in this kind of a paradigm.
Yeah, this topic of, as you said, the post incentives, sort of where all the action is, right? This is kind of the exciting part of it. And this is something that Kurt and I have looked at for many years. Conversations with Ron Kivitz in the early 2000s, there was a lot of discussion about that post incentive pause, that moment that immediately following the incentive, there's a drop off, but then this return to this higher level of, or at least, pre-incentive rates, or oftentimes even better. And I'm wondering, this has been something that sales managers have sort of bought into economically for many years. Why is it? It seems like it hasn't been studied all that much in the academic world. Why do you think that is, Indranil?
So it's primarily a function of the experimental design, right? I mean, the thing is, as I said, right, there are these two broad silos, if you will, one comprised of the economists and the other of the psychologists. They have used very different paradigms. So for the psychologists, what they have essentially mostly done, is they would look at behavior immediately following the reward period.
Mm-hmm.
And it's called kind of a free choice paradigm, where all you do is you remove the incentives and then you kind of understand, okay, to what extent are you spontaneously, voluntarily engaging in the task which were incentivized in the prior period, so to speak. And there, if you think about it, people are essentially making one decision, that is whether to kind of, continue doing the task or whether to do something else, right? In that paradigm, you cannot really distinguish whether there is a momentary disengagement from the task or there is kind of a persistent disengagement from the task. That one decision would often manifest as some kind of a disengagement, but the conclusion which often is derived from that behavior is that disengagement is persistent. That is, people would actually not be willing to do this task as much as they were doing in the pre-reward period. In contrast to this, the economists who have primarily run field experiments, and as you can understand, in field experiments, you don't have too much control, right? You essentially kind of understand that you're going to operate in a noisy world and you try to make the best, draw the best inferences you can. So there, you often look at behavior after, a certain point in time. You don't really study behavior immediately after the rewards and, systematically. So after 6 odd months, as I said, or after even, for example, a year, you see, okay, people are actually, reading books as much as they were reading in the pre-incentive period, and therefore there is no detrimental long-term effect. What I did is essentially I kind of married these two paradigms, and I actually tracked behavior, moment by moment, if you will. So essentially, people are making multiple decisions about whether to engage in the task, which is beneficial for them in the longer run, but clearly, requires certain amount of, effort and self-control to do it. But given that there is benefits, people appreciate and understand that, and they would be willing to engage in the task at some level without incentives as well. That's an important precondition, actually, because if there is no willingness at all to engage in the task without rewards, then essentially there is nothing to improve, and there is no possibility for you to, I should say this, okay, let me rephrase this part. If there is no intrinsic motivation at all to start with, that is, people are not willing to engage in the task without any rewards, rewards might help, increase engagement, but there is no opportunity for somebody to do less than what they were doing in the control. They can go back
said.
to
Yes.
not doing it.
Can't do less than zero, right? Yeah.
So that's an important precondition. There should be some level of engagement without rewards. And all I do is essentially have people choose between this task and an outside option or an alternative task, which is much more, leisure-like, right? Which is kind of what people would like to do. They would like to, sit and watch TV rather than go to the gym, right? So that is the kind of, real world, if you will, scenario which I abstracted in this experimental paradigm. And people made these choices multiple times. So I have multiple choices before the incentives was introduced. I introduced the incentive, and then after a few trials, when they made those choices with incentives, I then have a set of trials or choices without incentives. Okay, and with this, what I can do is I can understand if there is a dip after the incentives are withdrawn. Is that dip persistent or is that dip temporary. So that dynamic, that is why I call this a dynamic effect of incentives on post-reward behavior. That dynamics was completely conspicuous in its absence. That study of the dynamics, which I kind of introduce in my paradigm. The other things, these are kind of technical things, but as you understand, whenever we run experiments and controlled experiments, we are very mindful of, confounds, which often, is very difficult to control in a field experiment. And that's actually kind of the pro for a lab experiment or a controlled experiment versus a field experiment. So I actually also ensure that people know in advance that this reward is temporary. Because you can imagine that if people are taken by surprise that, the reward is withdrawn, they might be disappointed and stuff like that, right? So there are several other alternatives, for example, this disappointment, or, for example, inferences which people make about rewards. Why are you suddenly rewarding this task? Is it that you believe that people will not engage in this task without rewards? Or so it's kind of not a good, interesting tasks. And if people kind of, try to predict the motive of the policymaker, that might actually, be reflected in their post-incentive behavior, right? So those are the kind of things which we can control. And what we find very consistently is there is indeed a dip immediately after the rewards are withdrawn. The dip is very temporary. We call it the momentary crowding out. And subsequently, the engagement returns back to baseline. And in some situations, it can even actually climb at a level higher than the baseline level, by which I mean the pre-incentive level.
Yeah. So Cameron, Eisenberger, and Pierce had done a lot of work at 90s, early 2000s. Again, to this point, they kind of looked at it, I think, differently. And correct me if I'm misquoting some of this stuff. But my understanding is they were looking more at the design of the incentive. In other words, how you earn the incentive, thus influenced how well or how that impacted your subsequent behavior on this. And the idea, again, of, does the incentive design demonstrate mastery? Does it, bring in other factors that are self-identity building type elements into this world? I was wondering if your research, did it parse out anything about the incentive design, or were you just looking, as you mentioned, you had you had the incentive element that came in, and then you measured the post multiple times, which again is beautiful. Love that idea, that process. But did you look at the incentive design at all in this, or can you make any assumptions about that based upon what you've discovered if you did not?
So incentive design is actually a very big kind of subject. My focus was not so much on incentive design. My focus was more on the fundamental question of whether incentives affects and how post-reward behavior. In terms of incentive design, what I did is I actually varied the incentives, right? So I used kind of, low versus high incentives. And as you can imagine, if you're using high incentives, many of the psychological theories would actually predict a stronger detrimental effect after the incentives are withdrawn, right?
Yes.
Because people would think, oh my God, I was doing this task because of this high incentive and maybe not because I really like the task. Or because, high incentives act as a reference point.
Yeah.
Right? And people would think, I have this reference point now, and therefore I should actually, not do this task unless there is some form of compensation commensurate with that reference point. What I find actually, again, very interesting and kind of very different from what the predictions from the psychological theories would be, is with high incentives, actually there might not be any post-reward crowding out at all. People might actually think that, they actually had this great opportunity of working with this high incentive. And because the incentives were so high, they kind of feel that psychologically, this is a very psychological mechanism, that they feel that they actually are in kind of, in a state of balance, so to speak. They are not really, giving up much to kind of, exert the extra effort during the incentive period. And therefore, they feel less justified so to speak, to kind of, take a break after the incentives are withdrawn. And therefore, after the incentives are withdrawn, there is indeed a dip. They go back to the pre-incentive level, but they don't really go back below the pre-incentive level. And in the longer run, actually, higher incentives results in higher net engagement with the task, which is actually, again, an important thing for policymakers to know, I believe.
So this is really interesting. When you started talking about high and low conditions, my first thought was the Large Stakes and Big Mistakes paper, Dan Ariely and George Lowenstein, Nina Majar, where they found that it's possible to get to a certain point with an incentive that you can cause choking, like the incentive can be too much of a burden. Yeah. Obviously, you're not in that range, but the high versus low, right? But what you are saying is that the high incentive does lead to a better engagement, higher levels of productivity and performance in the long run.
That is true.
That there might be for the business side of me says there might be an ROI, right? There might actually be a value proposition for managers to think about higher rates of incentive in order to promote longer term benefit. Is that correct, Indranil?
That is correct. You are right when you said that my incentives are not in that range. I think that's the most
okay.
Kind of succinct and appropriate way to put it. Yes, if I give people kind of an astronomical amount of money for doing the task and getting the task right, clearly there is a possibility people would kind of choke. And their performance might suffer. But I'm not in that range. I essentially use high incentives but reasonable amount. The other part of your question was, yes, absolutely. In fact, what we find is even with low incentives, right? Even with any incentives, what people or what policymakers and what managers should consider is the net effect of incentives. What is the level of performance in the reward period plus the post-reward period vis-a-vis the pre-reward period, right? That's essentially the key comparison. And there we find incentives, in my experiments, even low incentives have a positive net effect, which essentially means that incentives are useful for improving people's behavior, engagement, performance, if you think of this as a long-term policy.
It also reminds me, we had a conversation with Jana Gallas from the Anderson School in UCLA.
Right.
Now her focus is more on design, and the design of incentives and sort of the appropriateness of the design, pro-social, tangible, non-tangible, whole variety of things there. But something that kind of strikes me about this is that even in these low incentive situations, it does seem like managers in the real world, in the wild, are not doing a good job of looking at the entire breadth of the performance, that they're looking at what happened during the reward period and not necessarily looking at what happens in the following 1 month, 3 months, 6 months, year, et cetera. Has any of your work been able to get out into real world experiences, into field experiments with this work?
So we have done some field experiments ourselves, particularly regarding, healthy food choices. And there again, what we find is, so what we do in this experiment is we partner with a cafeteria. We study the baseline purchases of, soups, salads, and stuff like that. We get the data directly from the company. And then for a few weeks, we actually incentivize purchase of these, healthy items by giving them like a $1 coupon, right? Mm-hmm. So essentially the price is reduced by $1 essentially. And then after a few weeks, we remove the reward.
Okay.
And then we study the purchase of these products. And there again, what we find is there is indeed a decrease in purchase of these items immediately after the incentives is stopped, because, people probably, and this is a cafeteria in a university, so it actually has a very, if you will, captive audience. They know that the incentives were present and now the incentives are withdrawn, that kind of stuff. So there is a effect after the rewards are withdrawn. But subsequently, it goes back to the control level. And indeed, there is a net positive effect of introducing this coupons and spending the additional money on people's purchase behavior for healthy foods.
Yeah.
So that's the field experiment we have done using this kind of a paradigm.
Yeah. Your research and this paper, I think, are really important to kind of highlight some of these facts that, again, go against some of that common wisdom that has been prevalent out there, or at least has been gotten a lot of popular press in various different pieces. Where do you see in this arena where you think the research needs to go? What are some of the questions that are still unanswered around incentives, around their long-term impact, around, the different aspects that might come into play around, again, as you said, policymakers and decision makers who are implementing these in their organizations? Where should the research be focused over the next 5 years to really help and inform and make sure that we're getting appropriate insights and we're thus creating incentives that are going to be the best possible incentives across the board?
That is actually a very important question. So a couple of things. I mean, one is, of course, I think organizations across different industries need to try incentives. That's, I think, the first thing, because currently there is such a strong kind of aversion to incentives. Let me give an example of a real world situation I actually faced. So I was actually talking to an NGO, and this was in India. They actually work with malnourished children, and they provide these food supplements which apparently would improve the health of the children, the young children. And I actually suggested, and they were of course trying to increase the uptake of these supplements. And I suggested, why don't we kind of incentivize them to kind of use this supplement? And they were like, no, this is completely a bad idea, because if you incentivize them, they will not buy this anymore at all after the incentives are withdrawn, right? So clearly they have this very strong belief, that consistent with what many of the psychologists would like to believe, that there is this detrimental effect in the post-reward setting. So I think the first important thing is companies should not be afraid of trying incentives, and it would help them if they can track the behavior in a more systematic manner, rather than kind of the behavior in kind of after 6 months or something, which probably will not reveal the true picture. So that's number one. The other thing which I think is important to understand is, all the research which I have done, at least most of the studies which I have run, have found that there is kind of a reversal back to baseline, right? Or control, or the pre-incentive level. I think the important question is, can we design incentives which can actually improve post-reward performance vis-a-vis the baseline level, right? I think that would be super interesting or important as well to policymakers and managers, because they would like to see people doing the task more than what they were doing earlier, by virtue of greater engagement during a temporary reward period, right? So there, I think we should kind of try to see the work on habit formation, how habits are formed, and stuff like that, and try to design incentives which kind of uses those insights and potentially would result in kind of a long-term positive effect. So the net effect of incentives would be stronger, hopefully, in these situations than what it would happen if you just introduce incentives. As I said, the net effect is always positive in my studies, at least, whenever you use incentives. But the question is, can we increase the net effect? I think is a important area which needs to be looked at. And the third thing is, kind of related point is, when you're talking about incentive design, not all incentives need not be tangible incentives, right? Incentives could also be non-tangible. For example, some kind of recognition and stuff like that. So how does that actually affect people's subsequent behavior? Is it the case that non-tangible incentives are kind of better integrated, so to speak, and people kind of, perform better, who knows, in the longer term because of that recognition or whatever non-tangible incentives they got? So I have some studies where I find that praise and also what I call performance internalization, by which I kind of mean, reflecting on how much you did during the reward period, right? I mean, think of a task like going to the gym. You were incentivized to go to the gym. You responded to the incentives. You went to the gym. You went to the gym more during the incentive period. Now, when the incentives are withdrawn, instead of just withdrawing it and saying, "Okay, goodbye, no incentives anymore," why don't we kind of engage the person? Say, "Okay, there were incentives. You used to go to the gym at this level in the pre-incentive period. You went to the gym at this high level during the incentive period. How do you feel about it? How proud you are about your performance? How likely do you think you will repeat this behavior after this period?" And stuff like that. Those probing and deliberations might actually incentivize people, or not incentivize in the economic sense, but kind of motivate people to persist with the task. So those are, I think, the areas which I believe needs further investigation.
Okay, Indranil, we've got like 90 more questions to talk about just from what you just said. But let me just say this. We're going to be in touch for a long time because we want to hear what happens with all of that. I want to reflect specifically on the second item, this idea of what can the designers of these incentives do better to engage people in the post-reward scenario. And I think that this is a really wonderful challenge to practitioners to start thinking about what can they do to design, not just for the incentive period, but to actually be thinking about the kind of impact that they want to have post-reward. Kurt, have you seen that in the wild? Have you seen anyone doing that?
I haven't. And I wrote a whole bunch of stuff down here going, all right, this is an interesting concept. To your point, I think that this is a really key aspect of what we could be looking at in the future to say, hey, how can we improve the way that we not only design the incentives themselves, but the communication and the follow-up and the other activities that surround that incentive in order to increase the net effect, as Indranil, as you were saying on that. So fantastic stuff. I know we have a limited amount of time. We had a couple other of your papers that we wanted to talk about.
Yeah.
Is there anything? So just real quick, in a short kind of period, help us understand, you sent us a couple other papers. Don't fear the meter. How longer time limits bias managers to prefer hiring with that versus with flat fee compensation. Help us understand what that is really quickly and kind of the key concept out of that paper. Putting you on a spot, I'm sorry.
Probably only took like 5 years to create that paper and just summarize it in, let's say 2 minutes.
Okay, that's a good challenge to have. So the idea is, there is some literature suggesting people prefer, flat fee or, flat payment schemes, so to speak. For example, think about this. Our cell phone plans often are kind of, flat payments, right?
Yeah.
Likewise, there is research suggesting that if you are thinking of gym membership, people prefer to pay a flat fee rather than kind of per visit fee, because it might actually, motivate them to visit the gym more often, because they are almost like, pre-committing to kind of, exercise self-control, if you will, right? What we find is in hiring scenarios, particularly when you're hiring temporary workers, managers have this preference for flat fee payment schemes, by which I essentially mean kind of a piece rate payment scheme, right? Do the work, get this fixed amount of money, particularly when the deadline for doing the task is longer. Right. So that's essentially what we find. And what we show is it's a suboptimal preference because managers are essentially going to lose money by making that employment choice. What we do in our studies, and this is beyond your 2 minutes time limit, is...
Go for it.
Yeah, this is good.
So what we do in our studies is we actually have participants play the role of workers, and then we actually measure their actual time, okay? Because we need their actual task completion times under different incentive schemes. And then we have managers who are, again, participants playing the role of managers, to be more precise, make hiring decisions where they are given a certain amount of budget and they would incur cost for hiring the employee, and the rest of the money, that is the budget minus the cost which they incur, is actually their bonus, which would be given to them for real, right? So it's kind of a consequential decision, if you will. And given that we have the actual time of the workers, what we do is if you choose a per minute, meaning essentially a worker who was incentivized, using a metered payment scheme, if you choose that kind of a worker, we are going to couple a randomly chosen worker from our pool of workers with that manager and use the actual time taken by that worker to decide how much bonus the manager would make. Likewise, if you choose a flat fee compensation scheme, we would couple from our pool of workers a worker who worked under that kind of a scheme and use his or her time to compute the bonus for this manager. So what we find is, based on this kind of elaborate design, we find that using the actual time the workers took to do the tasks, managers actually are going to earn much less when they are choosing flat fee compensation scheme. And just to kind of talk about the psychology a little bit, the idea is often what happens is people kind of underestimate how intrinsically motivated, again, kind of going back to our previous topic,
right.
people are. People often think that people are not very intrinsically motivated. People are very self-interested and stuff like that. And therefore, when you pay people by time using like a metered scheme, they might potentially, slack. They might actually take a lot of time to, earn more and stuff like that. And the other thing which we also find is kind of a cognitive bias, that when the deadlines are longer, people think that task or the scope of the work is actually bigger. And therefore, they feel that given this is a bigger task, it would, even if people don't slack, workers would end up taking more time. And therefore, it would cost me more if I pay them per time versus if I pay them like a flat fee, right? So that's essentially the psychology behind what we observe. And the consequence, as I said, is a suboptimal decision and economic loss for the managers.
What's fascinating about that is as a small business owner and that I hire in contract workers, I fit into your presumption right away, right? I much prefer hiring somebody on a fixed contract that you will do X and I will pay you Y, as opposed to you do Y and I'll pay you X amount per hour in order to get that done. And so now I'm rethinking how I go about doing this. And so I might have to do a field experiment of my own on this, Indranil, and just kind of see what we find out. So
you should.
And the other thing to mention here is think about a real world situation, right? I mean, often what happens is you engage with the same worker multiple times.
Yes.
Right? So there is an incentive for the worker to build what you might call reputation capital, right? So if the worker slacks, then clearly you might not hire him again. And the worker clearly knows about that consequence. So that again would be a further reason why this kind of a flat fee payment scheme might be a bad decision.
Yeah.
You see what I'm saying?
I love that. Actually, it always amazes me. There's this big blind spot, especially among sales managers, that they're really afraid that people are going to take advantage of them, like that the incentive or whatever the payment scheme is, that people are going to slack, that there'll be free riders at every turn. When study after study and field data over and over supports the fact that that's extremely rare. But before I'm afraid we don't have time to get to the last paper, but I do want to get a little bit of your musical tastes. I'm just kind of curious about, what do you like to listen to? How about this? Let's start here. Do you like to listen to music while you work?
I do listen to music all the time when I work.
Wow. All the time. Do you listen to a particular type of music?
Actually, yes. I mean, I must confess that my taste is kind of parochial as far as music is concerned. And it's not because I believe something is better than the other, but it's essentially a function of my non-exposure to other types of music. So,
you just like what you like. That's okay.
Yeah, so I'm actually very fond of Indian music, both classical as well as kind of as you probably know the term Bollywood.
Yes.
Kind of, it goes with Hollywood, that kind of music. So I listen to that stuff a lot when I work. The thing about Indian classical music, and this is just like my 2 cents without really being an expert on this subject, is I think Indian classical music is extremely, extremely kind of rich, if you will. I mean, if you think about Ravi Shankar, right? You probably have heard about his name. His music is like kind of a canonical example, if you will, of the classical music which India has. And I think that's very soothing and rich, and I like that.
Rich is a great word. I mean, finding the raga and establishing the raga in classical Indian music is such a beautiful thing. And rich is a word that absolutely applies, but doesn't get spoken of a lot when it comes to Indian music. And I think that's a great description. Did you grow up with it? Was there a lot of Ravi Shankar in your house when you were growing up?
Yeah, actually, Ravi Shankar is from the same part of the country where I come from. So clearly, Ravi Shankar is a big influence there. And I come from West Bengal, Calcutta. So that part of the country is also kind of very culturally sensitive, if you will. We listen to a lot of songs and music and stuff like that. So yes, the thing about richness which you mentioned, yes, and I think what amazes me is the grammar of music and how rich that is, and how intricate that is as far as Indian classical music is concerned. I'm sure it might be true, and it must be true for Western classical music as well. It has to be true, but I don't have any exposure to that. But I can pretty much vouch that it is super intricate for Indian music, and I really am impressed with.
Well, there is a really stark difference. The Western scale is only 12 tones, and the Indian scale is 22 tones, and that in and of itself fosters complexity and richness just by having more notes to go from. Kurt, I'm sorry, did I just lose you there?
I'm just saying that you guys, both lost me a long time ago, but Tim always loses me on these musical components when he starts bringing in the tonal aspects or the time scales that are at, different time elements and various different, all of those factors that come into play. But it is fascinating to me too. I think there is an interesting piece. And the idea that you talked about, this grammar of music, I find that that's just an interesting way of thinking about this, because there is this element of how music is composed that depends upon the grammar rules that kind of parochial area, as you said, or that type of music has. And so thus it creates a different musical composition. So, yeah.
Yeah, true. And I think absolutely. And I think Tim is like an expert in music. I should have educated myself more.
No, that's not the point of Behavioral Grooves, Indranil. No, that is not. But we want to thank you very, very much for being a guest today. And we hope that if we invite you back, that you would be generous enough to join us in the future.
Absolutely, Tim. It was great talking to you and Kurt. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you.
Welcome to our grooving session, where Tim and I groove on what we learned from our discussion with Indranil, have a free-flowing conversation, and talk about whatever else comes into our intrinsically motivated brains, even after we've been extrinsically motivated.
That was nicely played. Very nicely played, sir. Very nice. I like that. Yeah, that's it. That's the whole thesis. And this is something that I'm so grateful that Indranil and Oleg have done this work, so that we can now point to a published story to support the data that we've captured for years.
Yeah. And I think what's interesting about this, and we kind of talked about this, right, is that the popular belief that extrinsic rewards would reduce intrinsic motivation kind of dominated both the literature as well as kind of common popular pieces. It's that over justification or the undermining effect, whatever you want to call it, right? It started with DC and Ryan back in the 70s, and the research all the way through the 2000s. And it was good research. It was replicated. It was sound.
And then it got amplified in Dan Pink's book, Drive, right? The DC and Ryan work did.
Oh, and Alfie Cohn, who was on Oprah and talking about don't give your kids, stars for doing, getting an A, and so all this. And I mean, that research was good. It was always there. It was good. It was there. But I always had this inkling, even, basically it started from, a lot of the work that we did back in the early 2000s around incentives and other things and seeing how it works in the real world. But I always had this aspect that there were some flaws, that there was maybe some part of the puzzle that we just weren't looking at. And I actually, in my PhD program, I wrote a paper on how intrinsic motivation was operationalized in most of these studies. It was mostly through observation of free time activity, particularly with kids, right? And that observation was immediately following the intervention. But what was interesting is that if you asked the people afterwards, they didn't say that they had a decrease in motivation around doing any of these activities. It wasn't it wasn't a belief system that had consciously raised, which, you can go back and forth on. That's what we do in behavioral sciences, go, oh, well, they say something, but then they do something else.
Yeah, you can't read the label from inside the jar.
Right. But I think what this goes to is a lot of, this research by Indranil and Oleg kind of shows that maybe that was actually true, right? That they didn't have a decrease. They didn't want to do it right now. They wanted to do it later,
Right. Well, I mean, this reminds me of work that unpublished work that I did with Ron Kivitz in looking at what he called the post-incentive pause, and Kivitz, has collaborated with Oleg Urminsky on many papers. I know that they've been talking about this for years. So I'm so glad that they gathered this data, especially in the way that they did. We'll talk about that in a minute. But this really actually kind of confirms there's good scientific reason for us to believe that people don't feel a lack of motivation. They just feel like, I just need a little pause here at the end.
Well,
and then they're going to return to, if not the same level, but a higher level of performance because they built up habits of performing at a higher level during the incentive period.
That's some of the real world stuff you had. But there was also work even back into the 90s, right? That showed that Cameron and Pierce did a meta-analysis, right? Yep. And they looked at 96 studies and they found that overall reward does not decrease intrinsic motivation, right? They said that, and yet it still didn't get, that didn't get catch on. Eisenberger and Pierce did research that showed the way the incentives are designed has a huge impact on whether or not this happens. If it's just a do this, get that, then yes. But if the incentive design, the way that you earn the reward demonstrates mastery or competence, or that you are improving on something, then it didn't have that same effect. And in fact, it could sometimes even show that increase. As you said, they've learned something and now they're applying that learned piece because now it shows it's demonstrated their competency about this, and thus they are now imparting that at later times. And so you can get an increase in that. So all of these things kind of showed this, but yet popular opinion, general belief out there, even many of the, people that managers that we talk to. And I think Dan Pink's book, as much as I love Dan, right? I think it recently kind of reignited this idea that after $70,000 incentives you don't have to pay people. It actually decreases, because he just went back and looked at DC and Ryan without actually looking at some of these others. So
he's a great journalist. He had a great story to tell. And it is regrettable to me as well that there are a lot of people who are like, a lot of sales managers who are like, we got to stop any kind of extrinsic incentive because that's going to diminish any kind of performance. And it's like, no, that's actually not right.
So I will give this, and if Dan ever listens to the show, I mean, he was on it, but I don't know if he listens, but if he does, we should get you back on and talk about this. But, what I appreciated about Dan and what Dan's book did drive is that it actually brought the conversation back to intrinsic rewards, which is important as you are thinking about building an incentive system, building a total rewards program. How do you motivate and engage your people? You can't just have that one lever, which is rewards and extrinsic. You do need the intrinsic rewards that are really there. And so his book brought that back into the conversation. I mean, I had conversations with CEOs because of that book, because they read it. And then I was brought in kind of as a not to say contrary, but to add to that story to say yes, and, right? So
it is yes, and. Yeah. Okay, well, let's get back to Indranil's paper.
Okay.
So I love that they looked at this over time. Yeah. I think that this is one of the sort of the magic things about this is that they set it up with more than just one test, right? It was more than just do this task for 10 minutes and then we're going to measure what happens. The fact that they did this in multiple iterations, I think
30 iterations, I believe.
30 iterations, yeah. It really helps. It's like, okay, this is a thing. This really is a thing.
Yeah.
That's the cool part about it for me.
Yeah, and I loved how they operationalized this, right? So again, I did that paper on operational, and they operational by choice. And so you are doing it, and so they set up 30 trials. You chose between watching a video and then doing a math test. Which I don't understand why anybody would choose the math test, but right, that's a whole separate thing, right? So then they incentivized. So they did that. They had the baseline they set up. I think it was 9 or 10 of those series. Don't quote me on that. But I do know that they stopped. They started the incentive somewhere around 10, 11. They stopped it at 19, right? And what they saw was that, in trial number 20, those people who had been paid did see a drop. But by the 22nd, trial, it was back up to baseline. It was back up to the original piece. It took three iterations. That's it.
Yeah.
I mean, it wasn't it didn't have to go 10. You didn't,
Mm-mm. This is the magic. This is just to watch how this goes. And you and I have seen this in incentive program after incentive program when we look at the pre-condition data to see what the average baseline of activity is among reps, and then how they perform during the incentive period, and then what happens immediately after that. Yeah. And there is consistently this pause, that, as Kivitz would say, this post-incentive pause. There's a break because they're kind of, it's like, man, I worked really hard during this period. But then we see within days, they're right back up on it because guess what? They still have objectives to meet. They still have a job. There's still things to do. In the work world, work doesn't stop. You can't just stop working. So they jump back on the horse. And as you alluded to earlier, they've learned new techniques. They've learned new things. They built up new habits. They're used to performing at a higher level. And so very often in the real world, especially the sales world, we see that performance improve overall.
In the real world, yeah. I love it.
Yes, in the real world. Yes.
But no, you bring up a really good point, is that we have seen this. We've noticed this. We have studied this as part of the work that we've done. And it's just really nice that this research ties so nicely into that. And if it is confirmation bias, like we talked about at the very beginning of this, I'm sure that might play a little bit, but the research is there. The research is true. So Tim, what are some of the implications? All right, this is fantastic. So extrinsic rewards don't decrease intrinsic motivation. So what?
So as much as we love Dan Pink's book, Put Down the book Drive.
Well, no, you can read. They still have good stuff. They have some good stuff on autonomy and mastery.
Still great stuff on it. Let's just, for the record, agree that intrinsic motivation is not crowded out by extrinsic rewards. But let's just start there. And then let's think about what are the ways that we can ethically and positively add extrinsic rewards to improve performance, basically. That's kind of my first thought.
Well, I think there's this other piece that you talked about, the learning aspect, right? So how do we design rewards now that we know that the intrinsic part of this is probably minuscule or non-existent at all? But this idea that can we use extrinsic rewards to jumpstart intrinsic motivation or jumpstart learning around things? And this goes, I did a really quick down and dirty study at a conference one time where I had people.
I love this. People need to embrace this because this is a fantastic little piece of research.
So we had a stationary bike that was hooked up electronically to this tower of lights that lit up. I think there were 6 lights on there total. And, if you pedaled slowly, you could light up 1 light, and then you had to do harder and faster to light up 2, 3, 4. And by 5 and 6,
there was some effort in it, right?
By
It
5
wasn't
and
just
6, it was really effortful, right?
Yeah.
And so we had this set up. It was going, and we had it for half a day, and hundreds of people walked by, and nobody. I think we had 2 or 3 people say, "Hey, what is that?" And we told them, and then they asked if they could ride it, and we said, "Yeah, sure, come on in." It was we were talking to them, and then day 1, halfway through, we started offering T-shirts. Okay, you get a free T-shirt because we finally got the T-shirts in. So we offered
which is an extrinsic reward.
Extrinsic reward, right?
Yeah, okay.
And then we had a line. We had a freaking line of people to get on the bike. So this is the interesting part, though. So that's great, right? We know that. All right, no, you may not have intrinsic motivation to hop on a stationary bike to see how many lights you can light up. But the thing is we had the extrinsic, and so that got a lot of people there, right? We also had a leaderboard, but that's a whole separate piece. But we're going.
But how much effort was required to earn the T-shirt?
You just had
so
to
they get on the bike.
Yeah, you just had to light up 1 light.
Okay.
And guess how many people stopped? We had 103 people on the bike that we gave away T-shirts to. How many people stopped at 1 light?
I would think everybody would stop because economically speaking, the least amount of effort for the maximum amount of reward, right?
Yeah.
So all 103 should have stopped at 1.
Yeah, 1 did.
Yeah,
One person, 1 out of 103. 0 stopped at 2 lights. And then I think it was 6 that stopped at 3 lights and 15 or something at...
Yeah.
It was under 20% that stopped before, that stopped at 4 lights or less total. And then you had 5 and 6. Now, remember, this was at a conference. People are dressed in suits and different things. And to get to 5 and 6, you're sweat. I mean, you're starting to sweat. This is not an easy thing. And ultimately, I think we had 46 people get up to the top 1. And so it's a part of this. What we took from this is, look, we had people who they weren't going to hop on the bike just to see how well they did it. But once they hopped on the bike and they saw the lights light up, then they said, well, how far can this go? And then it became an intrinsic motivation. How well can I do on this? And so that is a key piece of this. And it was really interesting research anyway. So
let's just rewind for just a second. When there was no extrinsic reward, like 2 people out of hundreds and hundreds got on the bike. Yeah. So very, very low response.
Yep.
As soon as the extrinsic reward is introduced, lots of people join in. And then what we see is that intrinsic motivation kicks in, competitiveness, enjoyment of like, oh, it's kind of fun. I'm on the bike.
Yeah.
And that takes over, which is a really important lesson to learn when it comes to incentives. Yeah. It can be a Kickstarter.
That's a really good way of thinking about it, right? You can jumpstart your program through something like this. So, one other piece of this, and this is hopefully we can add to this through this, but also I hope this research that Indranil and Oleg did will reshape the public opinion. Because I think too long the public opinion has had this negative perspective on this. So, that I think is good.
Well, we're big influencers. I would expect that tomorrow,
Oprah will invite us on and we'll be talking about this. Oh God, that'd be
nobody even remember Dan Pink's book.
All right, get off of the Dan Pink.
No,
and
I'm with you. We love Dan, we really do. He's a fantastic guy. He's a very bright guy. He's very research oriented, and he's a journalist who crafted Drive as a way to get a specific point across in a wonderful way.
Yeah.
So,
and I will say, I do want to just end on this kind of piece is that, look, more education, more research is needed on this.
Absolutely.
Particularly, again, Alfie Cohen's book was on education. And I think that is a huge piece. If we now know that this isn't true, let's make sure it isn't true around education and kids and different things. But if it's not, the impact that could have on particularly in marginalized and low performing, schools, that if we can offer some small incentives and it doesn't decrease your intrinsic motivation, if we design them right and appropriately, and you can get test scores up and you can get learning up and you build on confidence and various different pieces, that's huge, right? And we've talked about sales performance. I mean, my God, you think about how you can use this, again, ethically within sales, just huge stuff. So,
absolutely.
Okay. So that should probably wrap it up. So my key takeaways from this conversation, Tim, is for me, again, that in the long term, incentives don't really have a negative impact on intrinsic motivation. Just like we always said. But yes, it's here. It's in a paper.
Finally, peer-reviewed papers make a world of difference. Okay, so there is a dip in performance after an incentive is removed, but it is only temporary, right? And this dynamic effect of an incentive only lasts for a short period of time, and then bing, performance rebounds.
Rebounds, which is one of my favorite stats in basketball, by the way. But nobody really cares about rebounds. But man, it's an important part of the game.
Really, are they really that important?
They are, in my opinion. Again, there you go. See, we need somebody to write a research paper on that, the importance of rebounds and how they get overlooked. All right. So companies and leaders, you don't have to lose any more sleep over this. You don't have to.
Yeah, you think anybody's losing sleep over this? I hope.
I lost sleep over this. Maybe I don't have to lose any more sleep.
You don't have to lose any more sleep over this. And listeners, you don't have to lose any more sleep over this. And with that, we hope that you get an incentive. You feel excited and rewarded by this week's episode to go out and find your groove.